So this is a webinar we just did in February, and the thesis to this webinar is that real estate, not gold, is the inflation protection asset. This thesis really started from my time in Venezuela. I was lucky enough to go and live abroad for a couple of years in Venezuela when I turned 18. And when I got to Venezuela, it was a huge eye-opening experience, mostly on inflation. And the thing that's really important to understand is that inflation will probably have a much bigger effect on your retirement than any other single issue. That's my thesis. And if there's one lesson to take away from this conversation, it's how big of an issue inflation is really going to have on your retirement assets because it makes everything more expensive. And the effects of inflation can compound really quickly because of how compounding interest works. There's a lesson from Maracaibo, Venezuela, where I got to live for a couple of years on my mission. So my thesis is this. I think that real estate is a much better asset for inflation protection, especially long-term leveraged real estate, than gold is. And gold has really been trumpeted as the inflation protection asset. I don't think that's accurate. I think rental real estate, not gold, is the inflation protection asset. And what I tried to get across when we did our webinar was to help people understand that inflation will probably have a much larger effect on your retirement than any other single issue because inflation compounds over time in a bad way, and inflation affects every single purchase for the rest of your life. And so inflation has a really eroding effect on your purchasing power compounded over time. So inflation really feels like more of a negative compound interest. But instead of it just being on one account, like your retirement account goes up compounding, inflation erodes your purchasing power in a compounding way over time on every purchase for the rest of your life. So inflation affects your credit card, inflation affects your bank account, inflation affects your 401k, inflation affects everything. And it is really insidious at how much of an effect it can have on quality of life and ability to spend. I learned this lesson really seriously in Venezuela. I was lucky enough at 19 years old to spend a couple of years on a church service mission. And when I got to Venezuela, the most common thing an American 19-year-old can find a way to eat is what's called pan francés, which is just French bread. They sell this little bread at every bodega on basically every corner in the entire country. And it's just a simple bread, a simple roll. You buy it, you pour yogurt over the top of it, and you have a meal that you can actually stomach and not get really sick. The bolivar, which is their currency, when I got to Venezuela, was trading at about 800 bolivars to $1. And what that means in practical living is that a pan francés when I got there was 800 bolivars. And when I got there, I was spending 1,000 bolivar note all day, every day. 1,000 was the most common bill that I paid for. And as a 19-year-old, it shocked me that anything could cost 1,000 of anything, but you get used to it. Different denominations spend different ways. The thing is, I was in Venezuela for 18 months, and Venezuela has had some historic inflation. But I was in Venezuela for this little piece right here. It was right after Hugo Chavez was elected, and they saw a little tiny spike in inflation while I was there. And so before I left Venezuela, the bolivar was trading for about 3,800 bolivars to the dollar. So it went from 800 to 3,800. And so what that means is the most common bill that I was spending by the end of my time in Venezuela was a 5,000 bolivar note for the same pan francés. It was fine for me because I was spending US dollars converted to bolivars. And so for me, it was the same thing. But for Venezuelans, it was really horrific. And this is the sentiment that I hope Americans would understand right now as we're seeing inflation for the first time in many of our lifetime. Inflation hurts the working man, but it mangles the retired. And my reason for saying that is anyone who's working, your wages will eventually keep up. Your wages will eventually adjust, right? Or that's at least the hope. Or you'll stop eating steak and you'll start eating hamburger. Your lifestyle will either go down a little bit, your wages will go up a little bit. Instead of a taxi ride costing $15, the taxi ride will cost $20. Everyone will eventually adjust, except for people who are retired and who can't make those adjustments. because they can't just charge $200 for a doctor's appointment instead of 150, which everyone else will. Right? Everyone else will just slowly raise their prices until a new equilibrium is found. They'll have slightly lower quality of life for a while. It hurts working people, absolutely, but it mangles retirement accounts and people who are already retired who can't deal with that because it raises the cost of everything. Your healthcare gets more expensive, your housing gets more expensive, your groceries get more expensive, your food, your education, your travel, your medical bills, your long-term care, everything gets more expensive. And again, inflation has a compounding effect. I spent a lot of time talking about the consumer price index on this webinar, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time today. But the long and the short is this consumer price index is busted. Anyone who understands the consumer price index knows that it's busted, and it's for a couple of really huge reasons. My big gripe is inflation is going to have a really direct negative impact on a couple of things specifically. It's going to have a terrible impact on Social Security. It's going to have a terrible impact on pensions or fixed income guarantees from companies to employees. And it's going to have a terrible impact on annuities, which is basically the three pillars of guaranteed income the US uses. And so not only is inflation going to be a huge problem going forward, but the US's solutions as far as financial planning for retirees, all the guaranteed pieces of income are going to react specifically poorly to inflation. For example, in the year 2022, 2023, we saw inflation somewhere. The CPI said it was 4%. I call bullcrap because every single thing on the planet went up between 15 to 30%, depending on what it was. Like steaks at Costco used to cost me $30. Now they cost 75. That did not go up by any 4%, right? The problem is the CPI said it was 4%. So Social Security is only going to get the 4% cost of living increase or something like that. Because the CPI is used to calculate cost of living increases on Social Security. The CPI is used to calculate pension increases. The CPI is used to calculate increases for annuities, if there even are cost of living increases on guaranteed annuities. And so the CPI is this one piece of the equation that everyone uses, but the CPI is super busted. And anyone who's done 15 minutes of research will be like, wow, there's a lot of reasons the CPI is busted. We can have a different conversation on problems with the CPI another day. But my main one is the government has vested interest in keeping the CPI low. Because if under my watch as president of the United States, the CPI is at 15%, it looks like I've lost control. It's going crazy. And then if the CPI is at 15%, if we're stating actual inflation instead of some kind of watered down, oh yeah, inflation's under control because we know what we're doing. If CPI actually is reflective of cost of living, then hey, then all those Medicare CPI adjustments have to go up by 15%. All the Social Security CPI adjustments have to go up by 15%. It would really wreck government finance having all these guarantees that all adjust on the CPI. As soon as the CPI looks nuts, all those guarantees have to adjust in a nuts way, which the government's not built to do. The government is not now, nor will it ever be nimble, right? And so it does not adjust well for rapid inflation. And you can see that by every country who's ever experienced rapid inflation has immediately seen a massive decline in social programs offered by the government because the government's all run out of money or have to start printing money massively, right? They go to 3 day a week schools and they do all these like third world country things because the government does not deal well with inflation. So it has a direct vested interest in presenting the CPI as a low number. The CPI is its own problem. It's got all sorts of inaccuracies. It is not a static thing. They use swap outs where they say, okay, we're just not going to price steak anymore. We're going to price hamburgers. So their cost of living decreases inside the CPI that specifically don't reflect people's living, that people have a lower standard of living now. And they're like, oh, yeah, people are just eating a lot more hamburger. They used to eat steak. Well, the person eating the hamburger who used to eat the steak has a lower quality of living. And that person says, hey, this inflation's protecting me because I can't afford steak anymore. And I used to eat steak twice a week. And now I eat steak, never, or maybe once a month on a special occasion. And so there's a lot of reasons why I don't like the CPI. There has to be an index, but a government controlled index from a government that has a vested interest looking like they know what they're doing has all sorts of problems. That's as much as I want to spend there. Another big problem with the CPI is that the market basket of goods, they're not identical. The market basket of goods used to calculate the CPI, the thing that you'll see is the things that have gotten less expensive, which drag down the average of the CPI. They'll say, hey, there's been 4% stable inflation for the last 20, 30 years. And when you add it all up and you divide it by whatever, maybe it averages out to 4%. The real truth is the things that got less expensive, I only buy once. The things that got more expensive and a lot more expensive are the things I buy every dang day, right? I buy those things 10 times a week. And so my actual living costs have gone way up, even though televisions, yes, are less expensive than they used to, hilariously so. That doesn't mean that I'm going to buy a television 10 times a week. That would be madness. And especially in retirement, where the thing that's gotten the most out of control, especially in the US, is healthcare. We're talking long-term care, assisted living, medical and retirement, major medical, cardiac arrests and heart attacks and cancers. Those are the things that have really gotten hyper expensive. And so saying, hey, inflation's under control at 4%, even if that is technically correct, it is absolutely incorrect when it comes to the living experience. And that's what people have seen in the US in 2023, 2024, 2022, after the pandemic, after we've seen our first spike of inflation in most of our adult lifetimes. It's that, wow, life got a lot more expensive, and they kept saying the CPI was under control. That is a huge, resounding problem. And the truth is, the government has every vested reason for saying it's not a problem at all. And beyond that, it has a direct, horrible impact on retirement income. Because if you're living off of fixed income, if you're living off of Social Security, $2,700 a month, over your retirement years, let's say you live for 30 years and you see your buying power over 30 years, that's almost this, right? That's a 30-year chart. If you see the cost of medical go up 200, 300% in 30 years, but you're still on a fixed income that only goes up by 4% per year because it's adjusted by the CPI. Wow, that's terrible. That's catastrophically terrible for you. And that's assuming nothing goes crazy like inflation can. So there's a lot of reasons that I don't like the CPI inflation methodology, but the long and the short is it has a huge, huge impact. Let's go to this example. So a real world example that I think was really instructive for me, and it was really tragic. This is the second time I'm shooting this because the first time I got all choked up. I know a really good guy who's a friend of mine in Venezuela who had worked for PDVSA, Petroleum de Venezuela, which is the big petroleum concern of the state. And he was making a really good living. He was one of the people we knew who had a car and a nice house. He lived in a nice area because he was making about $150,000 a year on his pension from PDVSA, from a lifetime of work. But he was retired. He's a nice guy. But he was being paid in bolivars. That's the really important part. He was being paid in bolivars. He was making $150,000 US equivalent, but in bolivars. However, over the time I was there, remember that bolivars weakened really substantially against the dollar while I was in Venezuela, right? They went from about 800 bolivars to the dollar to about 3,800 bolivars to the dollar. An easier way to look at that would be, hey, if they were 1,000 when I got there, a little bit higher, and there were 4,000 when I left, that means you could buy 25% of what you used to buy with 1,000 bolivars. Like 1,000 bolivars would now only buy you a quarter of what it would, or the money inflated by 4 times. So what that means in actuality is that $150,000 pension had effectively reduced its buying power by 75%. So when I left Venezuela, that guy could effectively buy $37,000 worth of goods and services for the same pension. And the reason that inflation is such an enormous problem with pensions is because pensions don't adjust. They adjust based on the CPI, maybe, or they don't adjust at all. And the way pensions are funded is that companies are going out and making investments. The companies have to put money aside. Pensions are just not nimble. They're the definition of rigid. And so the long and the short is, when I got there, he was living well. And when I left, he wasn't. And that wasn't even the worst part of Venezuela's finances. Over the next several years, Venezuela got even scarier when it comes to inflation. It became one of the real bellwethers of, hey, inflation can destroy you. The way that inflation is measured usually is how long does it take for a money to lose 99% of its value. Between 2016 and 2012, the Venezuelan bolivar lost 99% of its value, not 75% of its value, right? And then because they hit some real inflationary times, it then lost 99% of the remaining value in the next 14 months, and then 99% of its remaining value in the next 10 months, and then 90, again and again and again. And they did some crazy things. People who were retired got just absolutely destroyed. We're talking seven of these reductions in value to income, $150,000 where we started with our pensioner. When it lost 99% of its value, he had about $1,500 worth of buying power after that. And then it just went down and down and down. And people watching this will be like, well, the US is not going to lose 99% of its buying power. But over the period of this, watching this guy who had a fixed income, a fixed pension, he had guaranteed income that was going to last for years, went from $150,000 down to 1,500, and then from 1,500 down to $15, and then from $15 down to 15 cents, and then down to fractions and fractions and fractions of pennies. Guaranteed income should have lasted for life. But because it didn't adjust well for inflation, because inflation hit, it eroded his buying power so badly that $150,000 per year of pension is now worth like just fractions of a penny. So much that I can't even tell you what that means. A bajillionth of a penny, right? Same thing happens with Social Security. Same thing happens with annuities. All the guaranteed fixed income pieces don't adjust for inflation, but real estate does. I don't want this to be a hopeless discussion. Real estate does adjust for inflation. It adjusts for inflation really well, and we'll talk about that in our next segment. At this point, Venezuela's currency has lost so much value that you can just see it. And this was the case when I was there still. You can just see Venezuelan currency in the gutter because all of these are like one bolivar, two bolivar, 1,000 bolivar, 5,000 bolivar notes that are now worth effectively nothing. They use the currency when they do use it to like make art and other things. And so there's just completely worthless currency all over the place. Any cash flow asset that's based off the CPI will have the same fundamental weaknesses as this pension from the pension example, right? Social Security is only going to adjust based on what the CPI says or less. Pensions are going to adjust based on the CPI or less. Annuities are going to adjust very poorly. Unless you're buying an annuity that specifically guarantees it's going to increase value some way other than the CPI, then we have to say, okay, if it's the CPI that's dictating the cost of living increase or the payout increase, well, then the CPI needs to be reflective of the actual cost of living. There's some fundamental weaknesses in this. I'm sorry to say, there are fundamental weaknesses with the US's financial planning regarding inflation. And the reason no one besides me is saying it is because it makes everyone look bad. There's no solutions for it. And a lot of people have never lived it. Now, I had this horrible example in my real life where I got to live in an inflation that turned into a hyperinflation country, where I love the people there, and it may have left some scars. But what I'm saying is inflation injures the working man. It mangles the retired. I cannot overstate that, guys. I cannot overstate that. The prices on everything go up. It hurts in the beginning. This is the inflation cycle. It will hurt very, very, very bad for a short period of time. But then everyone adjusts and get used to it. Every industry raises their prices over time to establish a new equilibrium, and eventually prices follow, or it just establishes a new kind of lower quality of life standard of living, and everyone kind of moves on with their life, right? So that's what we've seen here in the U.S. from 2019 to 2024 is, yeah, prices went up. It hurt very bad for everybody for a little while. People started to get used to it. You started to get used to spending $100 at the grocery store where you used to spend 60, right? Every industry raised their prices. Now a doctor visit costs 250 instead of 150. Now an Uber ride costs 30 instead of 20. That everything eventually follows, and then hopefully salaries eventually adjust, or people just get used to a lower standard of living. A little bit of all those things tends to happen. In the US from 2017 to 2024, we saw an inflation of about 22%. CPI reported the whole time 2, 3%, 4%, right? It looked like it was under control the whole time if you just take the CPI. But if you look at it, there's articles all over that talk about how horrible the inflation really was from 2017 to 2024. Now, if people are like, well, that'll never happen in the US, so the dollar never will lose 90% of its value. It already has, right? The dollar has already lost 98% of its value from 1913 to 2018. And then from 2018, as we just saw in the previous slide, to 2024, it lost another 22% of its value, something like that. And the whole time, there's never a year really where they've been like, hey, inflation's out of control. There's been a couple inflationary years before my time, but it's just something people in the US have never had to deal with. And because they've never had to deal with it, we've all gotten used to the US financial model, which is Social Security is going to be okay there for us, maybe. Pensions, people used to have them before everything transitioned to the 401k. There's a whole different conversation around that. But the truth is, the dollar has weakened 98% of its value. It is on this, hey, weakening trajectory. And the pandemic and everything around the pandemic didn't help that at all. But just saying, hey, the dollar will never have that problem, it's already had that problem. It's having that problem currently. It destroys everything over time. And unfortunately, the dollar is in a position where it may be more negatively impacted from inflation than other things. There's other market factors at work here, right? The US's reserve currency status is a question mark. It's not a huge question mark, but if foreign nations stop using dollars to settle transactions like they do right now, that could mean trillions of dollars kind of reshoring to the US, which would be inflation in the US in a way that's hard to even fathom. US debt globally is now like $33 trillion. All right, just this madness number. And so they're saying we're not going to use the dollar. So all the dollars that used to transact with Russia and China are no longer transaction dollars. They're using their own sovereign currencies and they're accepting their own sovereign currencies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's market forces specifically at play against the dollar that are really, really bad when it comes to inflation and inflationary pressures. It's not just, hey, things got more expensive. It's, hey, the world is changing. And a lot of those changes have a direct inflationary impact. The US monetary methodology, financial planning does poorly with. We just do poorly with it. And the freaking fox is guarding the hen house. And the US is saying, hey, the government is saying, hey, it's fine. It's just fine. Yeah, that's exactly what freaking Venezuela said. They never said the whole thing's on fire. You should get out while you still have a chance. Take your money and run. No, they said, no, it's fine. We got this under control. So I just have no real faith that the government is going to have your back when it comes to inflation measures because their solutions are not nimble and they specifically have never had to deal with inflation really in our lifetimes. And so they don't have good solutions for inflation. And we have just seen inflation for the first time really in my lifetime on US soil. And we can all see they didn't do well with it. Like stuff's 20, 30% more expensive than it was 5 years ago. Social Security has not gone up by 30, 40%, right? Just look at any retiree who's living on a fixed income. It looks like a broke income because what I'm saying is true, and it's just hard to see unless you're living it. But if you're living it, I guarantee. Now, here's the silver lining to this whole thing. I work in real estate investment. We help people find, vet, and buy rental real estate. And I really think rental real estate does beautifully in inflation, especially with a 30-year fixed note. All right. Rental real estate does great. And so let's talk about that a little bit. Why rental real estate is a better inflation protection asset than gold. And it boils down to some complicated financial terms that I'm going to try to help you guys understand. But it's two sets of dancing partners, right? There's two different pieces of this equation. There's my debt position versus my asset value. That's the first set of dancing partners. And then there's my mortgage payment versus my current rent, right? Those are two completely different things. And what I'm trying to help everyone understand is those two things, if inflation happens, it improves our situation. It makes us richer. Now, you may say, but you've just talked for freaking 20 minutes on how inflation makes us poorer. The truth is, inflation makes people who own rental real estate richer in every single way that is possibly trackable, game, set, match, period. Inflation makes people who own real estate richer. And it's because real estate acts differently in inflation than everything else. So let's take these piece by piece. All right. Debt position versus asset value. What does that mean? How much I owe on my mortgage versus how much the thing is worth. So let's go to some simple examples here. You buy a bungalow in the 70s for $40,000. You put down $4,000. Bob's your uncle. Fast forward to now, 2024. That same bungalow is $470,000. What inflation did in this situation is it said, hey, your asset inflated in value. Your asset went up in value. But if you look at this behind the scenes, you can see this guy put down $3,900 for his property. He started out with a mortgage of like $36,000. The value of the asset went up. The debt did not. His debt position maintained at 36,000. He only owes 36 grand. The bank doesn't walk up to him tomorrow and say, "Hey, you now owe $460,000 on this thing you bought back in the 70s." No, absolutely not. So he owed a fixed amount where the asset went up and up and up and up and up over time. All right. And more than that, if it's a rental asset, then over 30 years, the mortgage is going to pay itself off on a 30-year fixed interest rate. Maybe the interest rate's improved over time and he refinanced a couple of times, right? And so the truth is he owed $31,000 and then he owed $29,000 and then he owed $20,000 while the asset went up and up and up because his debt position was improving over time, where his price, his value of the asset was going through the roof over time because inflation makes everything more expensive, including housing. Housing gets more expensive with inflation. And so if you own houses and then the market inflates, the value of the assets goes up, but your debt stays the same. Anyone within the sound of my voice, look at your house over the last 5 years. Did the real estate market just randomly get 30% more valuable? No, it was inflation, right? It was inflation pure and simple. All right, there's a lack of housing that's affordable. That's systemic and not going to change in the US. But the bottom line is inflation drove housing prices up from 2017 to 2024. And you experienced this. You might have had a mortgage on your property for $300,000, right? And in 2024, that house has gone all the way up. You might have bought that house in 2018, 300 grand. And then in 2024, the house is probably worth $550,000. You didn't make a magical investment. Inflation happened. And you can look at it now and be like, wow, I'm really good on my balance sheet. I got all sorts of equity in my property. And you look at that $300,000 note, the mortgage, and say, man, that was the best deal I ever made in my dang life. That's how inflation affects the value of real estate. Inflation happens, real estate goes up. If you had to sell it in the future for long-term care, for medical care, for any of the things that are getting expensive, for your kids' educations, which are getting more expensive, maybe downsize, get a smaller house, right? All those things, you're going to be able to sell that higher inflated value asset, and you're going to be able to keep living instead of watching your buying power completely degrade over time. Another example. Your debt position on that original mortgage, $35,000. Current asset value, $460,000. Debt maintenance started out at $340. I bought it from the 70s. Now it's the 2024s. It's now worth $500,000. Our debt position stayed the same, but our asset value went up. The second thing that matters is that our debt maintenance or our mortgage payment stayed the same, but our rent went up. Just like we've experienced in the last 5 years. My mortgage started out at $300. Maybe my rent was $450 to cover all the bills and then some, right? But now the rent's gone up to $2,600. Inflation made rent more expensive and it made housing more expensive. But the people who owned the houses, their mortgage payments didn't change. The bank didn't approach any of those landlords. The value of the asset goes up, the rent goes up, but your debt on the asset stays the same and your mortgage payment stays the same. And the difference of those two things compounding over time are insane, right? Those things will make you rich. House prices then and now in every metropolitan area. I picked a bunch of houses in, I think, Colorado. We had a bunch of suburbs in Colorado. 2007, 80 grand, 200 grand, 500 grand, million, 300 grand, 700 grand, right? It's happened across the nation this way. And the people who bought those houses in '07 and had someone else paying their mortgages the whole time because they're rental properties now have assets that are worth way more. And they got the gold, they got the silver and the bronze too, because their rents went up on those properties and their mortgage payments stayed the same. It's the two things happening at the same time. And I think we've seen enough of this to understand this is effectively the debt position on one of these assets. I tried to graph it out so you could see it. If our debt position started at 11 grand, it's going to pay off over time, right? But our asset value that we might have bought for 30 grand has gone through the roof over the same period of time. So our debt position actually went down over time to nothing. It certainly didn't increase. And so all of this inflation in the asset value is money right in our pockets. That means when the time comes that I have to sell this house for $305,000 to go into retirement, or to go into a retirement home, I'm going to have that money to do it. Whereas if it was in a fixed income annuity or a pension or Social Security was my only lifeline, those dollars may have degraded and I may need $300,000 to do the thing, but my pension might only be $25,000, right? As assets get more expensive, as services get more expensive, I could really end up in a bad spot. If I have my assets in real estate, even if it's not cash flowing incredibly well, and it's appreciating, that means I'm not getting eaten alive by inflation. So that is a huge thing that real estate has that gold also shares. Gold goes up in value, real estate goes up in value. That's very simple, right? But this is where real estate really pulls away. When you're looking at rent over time, average rent in 1980 was $300 a month. Over 10 years, it doubled, went up by a bit, went up by a bit, went up by a lot, went up by a bit. So that same rent that was $300 back in the '80s is now $1,800. I read the other day that first-time home buyers are looking at their payments of about $2,600, which is the highest it's ever been in recorded history. That's high prices and high interest rates trying to get a hold of inflation. But as anyone who can tell you who's in the market, yeah, high interest rates is no picnic either. And all that's done is kind of stagnate the real estate market for a little bit. They've stopped going up in value because it turns out buying a $700,000, $800,000 house at 8% interest is a hyper expensive prospect. I love that my real estate's going up in value. I love that my rents are going up. It's really hard if you're on a fixed income paying rent. Super, super hard, right? Houses then versus now. In the '60s, you might have paid 11 grand for a house. Now it's worth 380. In the '60s, it might have rented for $70 a month. Now it rents for $2,000 a month. Minimum wage in the '60s was $2,000. Now it's $15,000. That's funny. And so we can just see there the person who's really making out like a bandit here is the person who bought the house for 11K back in the '60s. It's now worth $380,000, whose debt service on that house was $60 a month, and whose rent is now $2,000 a month because their asset went up in value and their rent went up, where their payment stayed the same and their debt stayed the same. Can't overstate that. I hope it's making sense what we're after, because rental real estate does all the things you want in inflation. 30-year fixed interest is a magical thing. It's crazy that it exists in an inflationary time, an inflationary market, but I'm just going to take the good parts of the hands that are given to me. So if I can get into an asset that gives me more spending money every single month, if inflation hits, right, the rent will go up. Anyone who doesn't believe that rent goes up with inflation, just watch the last 5 years. Every single thing you'll ever find says that rent went up in the last 5 years. A lot. Way more than cost of living increases based on the CPI, right? Because that's what happens. Landlords raise their prices because everything costs a little more for them. The homeowner's insurance costs a little more. The HOA fees cost a little more. They may have bought property at an 8% interest rate, so they have to charge a little more. They did major structural improvements. It costs a little more to do that. Yeah, they're going to hedge their bets also, and they're going to raise their rents. And as the entire market raises rents, they'll raise rents too. And that's just the way it works while their payments to the bank stayed nice and fixed at $79. That is laughable, but that's what we're talking about. Real estate does a really good job of adjusting for inflation. 30-year fixed interest mortgage may be the ultimate tool to fight against inflation because your debt stays the exact same while the value can go through the roof. It's just an incredible asset. This is a note about interest rates. People are saying to us a lot these days because we're helping people buy rental real estate. That's our business at Bedrock. We help people find, vet, and buy investment properties. So we do have people a lot these days saying, hey, I'm going to wait to buy a piece of real estate until interest rates go down, right? What about high interest rates? We hear it all the time. What about high interest rates? What about high interest rates? This is a fiction that we all need to get out of. All right, we all need to get out of this question. I'm not sure who didn't teach us about interest rates, but this is a bad question fundamentally. Okay. Number one, interest rates are not high. Historically, in the 70s and 80s, they were much, much higher. They got up to like 18%. I remember my dad, who's old, I'm the last of 10 children. He is like most people's grandfather's age. He talked very, very openly and not lovingly about interest rates being 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18% when my mom and him bought their first houses. So number one, they're not actually high. They're historically medium to low. Number two, if I go and get an interest rate today, if I go get a mortgage today at 7.5%, let's say that's what I can get, right? If interest rates go up, which is 50-50, what's going to happen? If they're either going to stay the exact same, they're going to go up or they're going to go down. That's the only options. Interest rates can only stay the same, go up, go down. That's it. If I get one at 7.5% and interest rates go higher, then I will be grateful I got in at 7.5%, right? If interest rates go to 18%, I will hop down on my knees and thank God every day that I got an interest rate locked in at the now low, reasonable rate of 7.5. If interest rates go up, I will be happy that I got in at 7.5. Right? If interest rates stay the exact same at 7.5, then I'll be like, well, my rate's 7.5 too. And if interest rates go down, you're not stuck at 7.5%. Like anyone who says, hey, I got an interest rate at 7.5%, now I'm going to eat it for the next 30 years, didn't live through the last 30 years. Because what did everyone do in the late 90s who were borrowing at 5.5%? What did all of those people do when interest rates over the next 20 years got down to 2.25%? They all refied. Every single one of them refied. Every time the interest rates dropped a significant enough amount of money, they just refied. They went and got a new mortgage at a new rate. And that is a very tried and true established methodology. So if I go and I get my mortgage right here, right now, 7.5%, and interest rates go up, I'll be grateful I got it at 7.5. If interest rates go down, I'll refi. And if interest rates stay the same, I'll be okay that I'm at 7.5%. This whole I'm going to wait till mortgage interest rates drop so I can buy my first piece of investment real estate is an asinine way to think about money. That's assuming you're going to time the market just right and they're going to guarantee drop. No, 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 no. Go find a good piece of real estate and buy it. And then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again. And as interest rates go up, you'll be grateful you took my advice because you got in at 7.5. Or if interest rates go down, then do a little bit of work and refi them. We can help with that. It's not even complicated, right? You got a good mortgage guy. He's already got all your stuff on file. You send 3 more documents and you got a new mortgage. Sure, you'll pay a couple $1,000s in fees, but you'll have earned that many times over in appreciation if interest rates drop and prices go through. And so the long and the short is interest rates should not be the thing that stops you, because if you took 15 seconds and thought about it, you'd realize that interest rates move. You just lock in your interest rate, you get something that cash flows. If something cash flows positive at 7.5, it absolutely cash flows positive at 2.25, right? If something cash flows positive at 7.5 and interest rates go to 15, well, it's still cash flows positive at 7.5, right? You don't get stuck with 15 unless you did an ARM, which would be really stupid, right? Don't do that. So we're going to get 30-year fixed mortgages, and then we'll refi if the situation demands. Long story short, inflation wasn't always my biggest concern. I've just always loved real estate. I always wanted to have a real estate company. I always wanted to buy and invest in real estate. I think everyone does. We all understand that real estate's a great way to invest. Bedrock just helps it be as passive as possible while you still own it. Our model is a little different. Feel free to hop on our website and look around. We have a unique model because we help you find it, vet it, buy it, and then we help you deal with it. And we don't do a 50-50 partnership, which is kind of the industry standard. And we don't charge you an arm and a leg, which is kind of the industry standard.
If you've made it this far, I appreciate it. It lets YouTube know that you like what we're putting out and that you'd like to follow along. If you want to let YouTube know that even more, like, subscribe, share with a friend. If you want to see anything else that we've produced in the past, our entrepreneurial journey starting 30 companies, managing $300 million in wealth over 10 years, all the free advice I can give, feel free to like, follow along, share this with a friend. If you'd just like to see something that my team thinks is the best thing that would most interest you, click right here. Thanks for following along.